This is part of the Woven Festival. Tonight we have a talk which I bumped into Dr. Rebecca Gill at the University of Huddersfield and found out that there was such a thing as Hudfam. I thought, what on earth is this? And I thought, because we were working this year's festival around sustainability and we have been working with Hudfam, I just thought it was a perfect topic to actually bring into the festival this year. Lots of the work that we've been doing is about sustainability. The quilts, many of which, cost of living crisis, is about sustainability, reuse, and thinking about the materials that we use in craft, but also the messages that that creates into the world around us as well. So I'm really pleased that Rebecca and Bernard could be here this evening. I am going to hand over to Rebecca to introduce our speaker. We will be able to look at some of the material that's on the table at the end as well, not to touch unless we've got gloves, in good old conservation style, but yeah, I will leave it to Rebecca to do the introduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for giving us space in your programme to come and speak to you about the really interesting history of Hudfam. So I would like to introduce Professor Bertrand Taithe. He's a founding member of the Institute of Humanitarianism and Conflict Response at the University of Manchester, and has long been working on histories of humanitarian aid, looking at the everyday practices of aid giving, and researches into what motivated aid workers and inspired individuals to give of their time and their labour and money to work for charities or missions overseas. As part of the Institute for Humanitarianism and Conflict Response, Bertrand has been instrumental in founding the Humanitarian Archive at the University of Manchester, and this includes the papers of the founder of Hudfam, Elisabeth Wilson, including personal collections of her objects, one of which we have got today. So Bertrand has also been part of a collaboration with the University of Huddersfield on the topic of humanitarian handicrafts, looking at the long histories of making and selling handcrafted textiles as part of humanitarian work, whether this is French missionary fathers involved in setting up weaving projects in Africa in the 19th century, or embroidery workshops founded by Quakers to aid survivors of the Armenian genocide in 1915. And it is within this history of tradition and innovation that Hudfam, the Huddersfield Famine Relief Committee, sits. So please join me to welcome Bertrand to talk about this exploration of the life of Elisabeth Wilson and the pioneering history of Hudfam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I did ask if a French accent could be translated into sign language, but yeah, if you need sign language, you will probably get a better English than the one you will hear. I'd like to mention the fact that what we have on the table here actually was exhibited in Geneva for 4 months last year at the International Museum of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So, though I'm going to talk about a woman who described herself throughout her life as a mother of 4 and a woman of far town, that's how she described herself. She's by no means a parochial figure. She's a very significant figure in the history of humanitarianism, and of late with Rebecca, we've made sure that she gets as much notice as is possible. So what I'm planning to do is go through a few slides. Do feel free to interrupt me at any stage, or ask me a question if I can answer. Don't ask me the question of where the Hudfam shop was, because I don't know. I think it moved and it wasn't too different. But you may know the answer, in which case I will gratefully take that advice. Can you see? Well, we can see more or less. So Elisabeth Wilson was an extraordinary humanitarian and a remarkable person. But she, and this is probably a flaw in her character, wasn't native of Huddersfield. She was born in Richmond. She met her husband to be in Cambridge when she studied to be a geography teacher. And she actually moved up north in the 1930s. Now the point about Elisabeth is that she has such a diversity of activity that it's very difficult to pin her down. She's somebody who was a multi-activist throughout her life. And it isn't the case that she followed one thing with another. No, she actually added, multiplied, and connected throughout. So for example, she was involved in social work when she arrived in Huddersfield in the heart of the Depression. She carried on that social work throughout the Second World War. She was involved with refugees. She actually hosted Jewish German refugees in her own house during the war. But she was also involved with German prisoners of war until way after the war. She was a Unitarian, and she became a Quaker later on, but she started frequenting the Quaker meetings in 1942, and she was, throughout her life, a conscientious objector, opposed to war, a pacifist, an active pacifist, as I'll show in a minute. She, of course, founded the Huddersfield Famine Relief Committee, Hudfam, in 1942-1943, which makes it contemporary to a rather better known famine relief committee, Oxfam, which was created exactly at the same time by the same kind of people, by the way, Quakers, conscientious objectors. I'll come back to that in a minute. But later on in life, she became a CND activist. She became an activist against the war in Vietnam. She actually wanted to put her life in line of fire. She didn't manage, but she tried, and I'll show that in a minute. She was a traveler. She was also a journalist for the Huddersfield Examiner, which then, at that time, had published long reports on the situations of the world. So it's a different newspaper from the one we're familiar with, I suspect. I live in Meltham, by the way, so just to root my rootedness. And I used to lecture in Huddersfield, so this is I'm not really from Manchester, so forgive me. I'm French anyway, so. She's actually been credited by some historians as the founder of fair trade in the UK. So that's not bad for a woman who described herself as a housewife for most of her life. She was an Oxfam activist, but described the one she held on to throughout her life is mother of 4. So it's a very interesting character, but she's actually even more interesting than that, because we have a lot of sources about her. So this is Elisabeth at the end of her life. She left behind 2 volumes of autobiography, which she dictated when she was blind. At the very end of her life, she was 88 to 90 when she dictated. And they are remarkable texts, it's an extraordinary text, because she dictated an autobiography which is full of literary references, and she couldn't read anymore. She couldn't read, so she was absolutely astonishing. And we have, of course, papers in Huddersfield, in the Curtis Archive, papers in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and papers in the John Rylands, because we've collected her diaries, her dream diaries. She was somebody who thought dreams mattered. They were a way for her to connect to the collective unconscious. She believed in a collective unconscious. She believed that all human and all living things were connected. She has a very strange theology. Okay, she's basically a Christian Buddhist, possibly Hinduist as well. I mean, she's very open in her approach, and she left hundreds and hundreds of pictures from her travels. And these are the pictures that you'll see here. And perhaps we can circulate those, because they're not actually so precious. They were actually developed by the Red Cross in Geneva for the purpose of the exhibition. And she left, of course, a lot of interviews and private papers. She was a public figure in many ways. So as a humanitarian, she was actually, she married in 1936 to Hugh Wilson, who's here, who later on was a councillor on the Huddersfield Town Council for the Labour Party. Hugh was a conscientious objector as well, but he was also a chemist. So he worked throughout the war at ICI, just down the road, got elected as a councillor after the war. And they both belonged to the Unitarian Church, so they were both pacifists by religious conviction as their main point. In many ways, arrival in Huddersfield was a bit of a shock to her. She describes Huddersfield as being a contrast with Richmond in the south of England, especially because the economic situation of the interwar was extremely difficult. So she started working in soup kitchens and sort of poor relief, if you want, at that period, and she did some social work in Oldham with some friends, social work being slightly different from what it would be regarded today. But it is really in the post-war that she's going to become an extraordinary humanitarian. So she started Hudfam, and I will mention that in more detail in a minute. But what's interesting is that Hudfam and Oxfam were two organizations among many. There were probably about 100 or more famine relief committees across the United Kingdom. But only two survived the war, and only two survived until the 1980s, and that's Oxfam and Hudfam. So Hudfam has that particularly good or privileged position of being a long-lasting organization. And for a very, very long time, until the 1990s, there was no Hudfam shop in Huddersfield because Huddersfield was the land of Hudfam. So the two were connected from the 1960s onwards. The idea of a charity shop, by the way, was a sort of reinvention, but it's an Oxfam reinvention. In 1947, the first Oxfam charity shop was opened by a chap called Cecil Jackson Cole. And Cecil Jackson Cole was a personal friend of Elisabeth Wilson. They shared a lot of things, including mystical religion. And Cecil Jackson Cole also founded Help the Aged later, so a very major figure. Cecil Jackson Cole was a millionaire, totally different from Elisabeth, who wasn't particularly wealthy, though she was completely middle class. In 1959, she is credited for inventing fair trade, but in a very specific way, really. She actually met Pastor Ludwig Stumpf from the Lutheran organization, so the Lutheran organizations for refugees in Hong Kong. At the time, in 1959, Hong Kong was absolutely crowded with Chinese refugees who had fled the war and the arrival of the communists in 1949. So for 10 years, you already had masses of refugees. These refugees made a number of things, including a tea cozy. So this tea cozy, there's a coffee cozy as well, was actually imported by Elisabeth Wilson. And you can see, if you go inside, there is a label that explains that it is made by refugees. It's made with silk, and it was sold through a catalogue that was printed in Huddersfield, and through which you could buy a range of artifacts, all made by refugees. This was in 1959, and at that time, Oxfam's shops were only selling second-hand clothes. They weren't selling any artifacts from the world. They were just selling whatever people brought in. She's the first one, therefore, to have brought in the sort of handicraft that people made for a living, for survival, and to bring it in the market and distribute it through catalogue mail order. And in 4 or 5 years later, Oxfam actually took over the operation, and it is what you see now, which is the Oxfam shop, which is replete with objects, each of which is identifiable to a particular situation, a range of people, a story, if you want. So she kind of invented that, and very interestingly developed it. But unlike what we see elsewhere, in Oxfam, Hudfam has not become an international brand. So whatever happened? Is it because Huddersfield is smaller than Oxford? But to an extent, it is because the Hudfam group remained a very small group of women, mostly, with a nominal the mayor of Huddersfield was, if you want, presiding over it, but it remained very small, very local. It raised money, and it didn't actually do things abroad by itself. So what it did as a committee was to gather money and give it to the Quakers, for example, or later on to Oxfam operations. So it never was, if you want, an operational gathering, but more a fundraising organization. And Hudfam was actually created in Elisabeth's house at a meeting of pacifists in which Vera Brittain came, And at the end of the meeting, they decided to create Hudfam. And what's interesting about this creation of Hudfam is that it's created in response to a famine. And the particular famine that Hudfam responded to was the famine in Bengal. Now, the famine in Bengal is important because it's a famine in the British Empire, in a country, India, that was under British domination during the war, very much on the... If you think about Bengal, you remember that Bengal is not very far from the border of Myanmar, not very far from what was called Burma, and of course the Japanese were invading Burma. So it's not very far from the border. But it's a famine of incompetence, essentially, a famine of colonial incompetence. It's a so to do a famine relief committee against a famine that is pretty much presided over by the British government is to make a political statement against the state. Oxfam was also created in response to a famine, but not the Bengal famine. Oxfam was created in response to the famine of Athens in Greece, which was then suffering from a naval blockade by the British Navy and was also therefore victim of a kind of war on civilian by the British government. So both were critical of the British government, but not for the same things. So kind of an interesting aside. It joined with organizations like the Bengal Assistance Fund, Save the Children and Friends, and of course the Friends Ambulance Unit, which was the Quaker movement. In the 1950s, the line was basically to join in organizations and movement, and in the 1960s as well, and especially a movement called the Freedom from Hunger campaign. And the intentions here were to raise money to help people develop agriculture and develop self-sufficiency. So we're very much in a sort of Oxfam perspective. We're going to end hunger by teaching people how to. You remember the motto of Oxfam, which was give somebody, give them a net and they will actually fish for the rest of their lives. In a sense, we're trying to, and probably deplete the resources of the lake. But they also this notion that you could teach people to extract more value from the land in which they live. So far so good, in the sense that Hudfam became a subservient organization of Oxfam, provided its funding. 65% of its funding went direct to Oxfam. The rest was spent by Hudfam itself, sending money to various causes. And this is where it gets really interesting, because at an age when Elisabeth Wilson could have started to think about early retirement or easing things a little bit, she really took off. So Elisabeth Wilson is an amazing role model for those of us who are reaching an advanced age, because at the age of 52, she becomes an international actor. And she starts traveling to places you and I don't want to go. We say war zones, disaster zones. And in 1960, her first trip, after her mother passed away and she inherited some money, was to go to an earthquake. An earthquake which took place in Agadir in Morocco. It's one of the largest earthquakes of the 20th century, destroyed the entire town of Agadir. So if you ever go on holiday to Morocco, Agadir is a place to visit only if you're interested in 1960s architecture, which, by the way, it is now a listed site for that. But she went to Agadir in Morocco, and what she found in Morocco was actually that there was a war nearby. So you can see here, this picture here is actually typical of Elisabeth Wilson. She's going to look at the victims of a disaster, and she finds another disaster next door. And the other disaster next door is the Algerian war. The war the French are fighting against the Algerians. And she's also reporting back to the good people of Huddersfield about what's happened to their gifts. So the pictures you see here, this was a slideshow that she used in schools and in meetings, very much like this one, to explain the world to people, to explain where their money was going. She shows where the second-hand clothes were going, and she also shows where the knitted, the woven clothes were going. So people had knitted blankets for the victims of the earthquake. She shows you that those blankets are now helping to keep these children warm. Incidentally, she was also a weaver, so she fits with this festival remarkably. She was a handloom weaver. She wove at home as well. So she got involved, if you want, in a first trip, which was the beginning of a long sequence of travels, and I'm not going to mention them all, but I'll mention a few of them because they are really representative. But she also became very involved in developing Oxfam policies. So she became actually part of the Oxfam committees, deciding where money and where things would happen. So Hudfam and Oxfam, if you want, through Elisabeth Wilson, started to merge. This is from Oxfam and Hudfam gathering in Wakefield in 1962. The origins of fair trade, I've mentioned briefly, took place around 1959, but it's really important because it's a way for people to consume, to participate through consumption into a humanitarian effort. If I tell you, buy this piece of this piece of cloth because it's made by a particular woman in a particular place, and this woman has 2 children or siblings. She's the bread earner. She's bringing you into contact directly through this piece of fabric with the reality of her life. That's what it is about. It isn't really about the fabric, it's not really about the objects, it's about making a connection between you, the consumer who actually likes a nice rug, and the actual producers. And that's really the extraordinary storytelling effect that she launched. And you can see vaguely, because the light is very poor, but you can see some pictures, for example, of women who learned to make carpets or to mend carpets in Lebanon in the 1960s. The first picture, it's very difficult to see, but you have to take my word for this. This picture here is about, you can see just about a sewing machine, yeah? Now you can, come on, yes you can. Over there, you can see a sewing machine. This is where they made this. Okay, so this is Hong Kong in 1968. These 2 women were weaving, were actually making carpets. One of them is here, so you have a better image of it. Actually, from a school in Lebanon. But there's poignancy in this picture because this image was taken a matter of days before the school and the entire neighborhood was destroyed by war, and the civil war in Lebanon was about to unfold. So she made those connections, she made these stories speak to a wide range of people, and she was really a thoroughly engaging speaker. She was actually one of the main activities throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s is to speak to people like you in gatherings such as this one. But she was a bit more than that. She was also the kind of person who sits down and refuses to move when the Americans bring their submarines and nuclear weapons to Scotland. So in 1962, Elisabeth Wilson gets arrested for a protest against the Polaris missiles in Scotland. Now, she's middle class, okay? Middle class people don't go to prison. So instantly people have raised the £16 of fine that she was charged for. And of course, the first thing she did was to refuse to actually be bailed out. So she basically stayed in prison and then wrote to the prison warden very, very harsh letters about the conditions of the prison. And she became a sort of a little campaigner about female prisons in Scotland, which in 1962 can't have been a very pleasant experience. But very interestingly, you can see that she's somebody she's immensely connected to the middle class, but she's a very idealist person, she's very engaged. And this is the beginning of her career as a pacifist, but not the end, because in 1968, she joins a bunch of pacifists who are hoping to stop the Vietnam War. And the way they're planning to stop the Vietnam War is by putting themselves in the line of fire between South and North Vietnam, the most heavily bombed place on earth at that time, and a place which even today is so heavily contaminated with explosives, and I've seen this myself, I've been with the deminers, that if you go there and you want to build a football pitch, the deminers will find about 120 explosives in that surface, dating from that period. So that's where she wants to go. She wants to go and camp on what is the most heavily bombed place on earth. The North Vietnamese don't think it's a good idea. the South Vietnamese don't think it's a good idea, so they don't end up in Vietnam, they end up in Cambodia. And very interestingly, so this is the Prince of Cambodia doesn't know what to do with his British pacifists, so he puts them in a sports center in the middle of Phnom Penh, where he leaves them there, thinking surely the heat will get them to move eventually. But they don't. They actually stay there for quite a few months. And she actually used the opportunity to meet the great passion of her life, which is essentially practitioners of Eastern religion, in particular Buddhism. And she became a very learned Buddhist and a very extraordinary, cultured thinker in religious terms. But while in Cambodia, this is typical Elisabeth Wilson, she also observes other things. So she observes, for example, the work done by UNICEF, the vaccination campaigns that are going on, the kind of humanitarian work that is going around in Cambodia. Cambodia is, by then, 1968, becoming the most heavily bombed country on earth. The Americans have started a secret war that will only end in 1973, and that secret war, which the Americans do not admit, actually is something she reports on. And she reports on it because she sees the villages that have been destroyed by the Americans, and these two little girls, whose face is probably more visible here, these two little girls have spared you the other pictures, because these two little girls were entirely burnt by napalm. So the only thing that is actually not scar tissue is their face. There are other pictures, but I think it's probably best if I keep it at that. But in 1968, no one knew that America was bombing Cambodia. No one actually really paid attention to that conflict. And yet, Elisabeth Wilson was there, and she reported later on this particular war to the pacifist and anti-war meetings she frequented. Having said that, she got bored, because she was, I think, quite an impatient woman. I've never had the pleasure to meet her, but I've read a lot of her writing, a lot of her letters, and they are pretty direct. She likes things to move on. So she abandoned a group of idealist, pacifist thinkers who thought there is a place where we can do real work, and that's in Hong Kong. So she moved to Hong Kong in January 1968, with the idea of jumping on that boat, the Phoenix of Hiroshima, in order to join American pacifists and to actually bring pacifist goodwill to the Vietnam War. The Phoenix of Hiroshima didn't depart in January 68 because the Tet Offensive, the great worsening of the Vietnam War, had begun. But she got arrested again in Vietnam, because, in Hong Kong, because she was giving pacifist literature to GIs, American soldiers, who were going for their rest in Hong Kong. So she tried really hard to be as active as possible. At the same time, and this is the interesting thing, she was actually, and these are pictures more for the amateurs of Huddersfield local history, but she was also involved in the Labour Party. So these pictures come from the visit of Harold Wilson in his famous Mac, his Gadex Mac, visiting Royce Hall with her husband, who was in charge of education for Huddersfield. So that's in Royce Hall as well. And this is the great banquet in 1968. So this woman went from Phnom Penh, Hong Kong, get arrested in Hong Kong, to welcoming Harold Wilson 3 months or 5 months later in Huddersfield. And that's a constant of her life, that she managed to keep the external affairs, if you want, the international business, and her personal Huddersfield connections very much alive throughout her career. She was also a traveller in India at a time when it was actually quite difficult to be a traveller in India. So if you think of Elisabeth Wilson in a way, she's almost like a very, very middle-aged hippie. She actually follows the trail all the way to Kathmandu. She travels to places that only hippies from the West are traveling to at that time. She's traveling to India, but when she goes to India, she's not a tourist. She's visiting either Quaker missions in the Nilgiri Mountains, for example, where her son got involved, or she's visiting the ashram of Gandhi, so a Gandhian ashram, for example, to meet friends that she's made in the 1940s. She was already connected to philosophers, to pacifists in India, and to pacifists in Vietnam. She has this incredible network of pen friends throughout her life. But interestingly, when she comes home in Huddersfield, she discovers that Huddersfield actually, she knows, because she lives in Far Town, yeah? So she knows that Huddersfield is becoming a cosmopolitan environment and that it has to embrace the new populations that are now moving to Huddersfield. And she is actually involved, for example, in, I think, probably one of the very first Diwali that ever took place in a school in Britain in 1966. So she's involved in setting up and introducing Indian religions, mostly Hinduism, but also Islam, to the curriculum in the primary schools of Huddersfield. And that's, as far as I know, ahead of some of the great initiatives that took place in the 1970s. She's about 4 or 5 years ahead of her time. She's very interested in those connections, if you want. But she's also somebody who's not afraid to go to very difficult places. So she's, for example, in Bangladesh in 1972. The war is still going on when she's in Bangladesh. She's also in Vietnam, South Vietnam, in 1973. And the war is going on in 1973 in South Vietnam. And each time she's getting involved, trying to show, to understand what the needs are, trying to bring the money from Huddersfield directly to the key actors. So literally, for example, this picture of the boy on a sort of weird cycle, that's actually a prosthetic cycle for an amputee. She brought the money from Huddersfield to pay for this. And she took it to these orphanages in South Vietnam in 1973. She was also involved in the bigger picture of Oxfam programming, and Oxfam at that stage had developed real expertise in, for example, providing people with water and shelter. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that for her, none of this made sense if you didn't think of it as a kind of personal, theological, spiritual quest. She was fundamentally religious in a very deep way, a very profound way. And that's one thing she did throughout her life. She was involved with the social Buddhism movement in South Vietnam. She was involved in visiting religious sites. So there's a picture here of Amritsar. She was very moved by the discovery of religious cultures. This is a quote from her. So when I first encountered Taoism and Confucianism at the age of 14 or 15, around 1924, I was reading Buddhist sutras on the intellect of Confucius. I thought I will establish a church where Christ, Buddha, and Confucius were worshipped. She then says, of course, now I realize how ridiculous this is, but this is somebody who's been thinking about this matter of world religions since the age of 14, 15, and she carries on throughout her life. At the end, she describes, she was also a folk dancer. Did I mention that? She was a folk dancer, and she organized a folk dancing club, so sort of Morris dancing type thing. She had a big room in her house, a billiard room, in which they danced. And for her, Morris dancing was folk dancing, the Shiva Nataraja dancing, and Sidney Carter's Lord of the Dance expressed the same rhythm of life and rebirth, and the dancing subatomic particles of which we are composed. So for her, it all made sense. For you, it doesn't, because I'm looking at you and you're thinking, my. No, she did make those connections between the daily life, the daily chores, and the most profound spiritual things. And all her writing is consistent over a period of 50 years about the single-mindedness of this woman. So quite an extraordinary character. I hope you agree with me. Just to add another layer to her life, she became one of the most certified practitioner of Ikebana, the Japanese art is Zen Buddhism. Here we're moving one step further into the abstract, and she became one of the most. She had the most qualifications. She actually went and spent a year in Japan to learn the art of ikebana, the art of flower arrangement or plant arrangement for spiritual purposes in Zen cults. This is in the early 1970s. So if I tell you this woman is way ahead of the trend. Now everybody probably among you is doing ikebana, and you're going to tell me actually that is not a great picture. But I think she was formidable in this remarkable way. So how do we think of her? Well, we could think of her as just an exceptional human being, one of those extraordinary weird people that from time to time emerge in any society. But I think that would be unfair, because I think it would be unfair to two things. It would be unfair to the fact that across Britain there are women like Elisabeth Wilson. We just happen not to have as much evidence about them as we have about her. So I think she's exceptional, but I don't think she's that exceptional. I think she's one of those people that epitomized, that became the embodiment of something really forceful, which was basically a desire to find out more about the world and try to solve some of its troubles at a particular time in history. I think across Britain you have, in the 1960s and 1970s, a surge of interest in the poverty of the world, in the sufferings of the war. People are demonstrating. There's a political yeast at work. There's a kind of brewing of feeling. And she's one of those. So I think we should put her back in her place. She's a remarkable woman, but so are many other remarkable women and men. And I think she belongs to that category. In the 1960s, we have, of course, globalization. We have the first instance of globalization. You can take a plane in the 1960s to go abroad. You couldn't in the 1950s. Well, you had a fair chance of crashing if you did. In the 1960s, you can actually buy lovely products from the rest of the world. African artisanal stuff will start to appear in your local shop. You will start to get a broadening of your horizon. You can buy Chinese furniture on Huddersfield Market. All of that is new, and she's part of it. She's also she's a voice that made you aware of all those crises as they took place, and she visited them at the time when they happened. I mean, to be honest, traveling with Elisabeth Wilson is like traveling with the angel of death, because every time she went somewhere, a war was about to start or a war just finished. It's actually a really harrowing set of travels that she undertook. For fact-finding, that's the main thing, she kept this notion. Interestingly, of course, she did this between the age of 50 and the age of 90. And I think mostly between the age of 50 and the age of 80. But it's kind of remarkable, in my view, that somebody could actually go that far in a militancy and put herself in some really considerable danger. She could have died a few times in her travels. And this is two remarkable texts, but I don't think you can read them. So if you allow me to read a little bit from them. This is written at the time when she's actually going blind, okay? So the first thing is to say, well, when I knew I was going to hospital, I was well prepared. I had In the Footsteps of the Buddha, which is a book that was published in 1923, by the way. So she has this really light tome, which is a big book. And which is the story of a Chinese Buddhist monk, blah, blah, blah. And on the way, he encounters the many dangers of a lone traveler. The many dangers he faced in the spirit, reminiscent of a true Quaker, is nourishing food for contemplation. But a year later, with no sight at all, she's done completely blind, and 5 days waiting in the hospital before an operation was a more difficult problem to solve. The Tibetan Book of the Dead tells the pilgrim to face the angry ghost and other archetypes of Tibetan Buddhism and walk on. So I tried to do just that. I'll leave it to that, but the rest of the text is equally extraordinary, because at the end of the text she actually finishes with a reference to a very recent book on particle physics, which came out the year before. I've checked it yesterday, and I just thought, okay, at the end she actually makes all those references. So she could actually go from the religious to the spiritual And then make some jokes as well about a tape of Flanders and Swan that actually lifted their spirit. So quite a remarkable person. I'm glad you made her acquaintance. I thank you very much for your attention. Do you have any questions? Because I could go on and on for hours, and I probably did actually. I didn't check the time at all. Yes, please.
Can I ask about the famine relief in the 1940s in Greece
Yes.
and Bengal? I just wonder how successful you think those attempts were. I've read a bit about Vera Brittain and her work in Greece at the time, and she claimed it had been quite successful, but I couldn't really find anything to sort of verify that really. So I just wonder, both and Bengal as well, which I don't know much about, but just wondering how successful you feel the Hudfam and Oxfam attempts were to relieve it.
So if you want to read on Bengal, I suggest you read this book, just came out. It's called Hungry Bengal. And there is not a single reference to Hudfam or famine relief. Because the reality of famine relief is that famine relief tends to be successful only on the margins of what is usually a complete social collapse. So we have, as historians of humanitarian aid, we have to be very aware that there are serious limits to what people could actually do and how many people it could reach. So, but that's the point being that saving one was the purpose. One life saved was more than could be expected. So I think it was successful in the sense that it generated interest in a famine that was a colonial famine, and it's a very important famine, the famine of Bengal, because it's the famine that has been experienced by a famous economist called Amartya Sen, and who actually wrote about the fact that famines are always crises of entitlement. In other words, never food that's completely missing, it's money. And what happened in a society where people are not free is that people are suddenly unable to get what they need. And he points out that there were 90-odd famines under colonial rule in India, and there hasn't been one since independence. So there's something to be said about the fact that disenfranchised people suffer. So, long answer, but I think what we need to keep in mind is that those relief appeals mostly are about bringing consciousness here about what goes on over there, rather than affecting fundamentally the circumstances over there.
Yeah, thank you.
I probably failed to list at the outset, for which apologies, but could you remind me what brought her to Huddersfield in the first place?
What brought her?
Yeah.
Well, her husband was a chemist.
So it's the university or?
ICI.
Oh.
So he went to work for ICI until his retirement in 1968, I think, or something like that. And that's what brought her to Huddersfield. So employment opportunities, very much like me.
And me, actually.
But, it's a nice thing to happen. Yes.
I think I heard you say at the very beginning that one of the things she wanted to be remembered for was being the mother of 4,
Yes.
and there hasn't been any mention of the family in the talk.
No, that's good.
As a full-time, obviously I'm retired now, as a full-time working mother, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how did she do that? And what happened to the kids?
Okay, I'll tell you what happened to 2 of them are still alive and are very generously lent us or gifted these archives. Peter lives, son Peter lives in Huddersfield, and son Robert lives further afield, so Shrewsbury. 2 of our children have died, unfortunately, and those 2 followed directly in her footsteps. So our daughter Erica was born with a very heavy disability, and she had a major health problem throughout her life, but she was one of the Clapham Common activists, pacifists, and she got arrested for it. And she is a personality in her own right. Unfortunately, she died before I could interview her a few years ago. And her son, Johnny, died during COVID. I think of cancer rather than COVID, but he had lived his entire life from the 60s onwards working in the Nilgiri Mountains with tribal people in India. So the two of them followed directly into her footsteps. And the other 2 lived, I guess, lives like yours and mine, or perhaps there's more sedate lives, and didn't get involved as much in the humanitarian or pacifist activism of their mother. Both of their children, interestingly, were quite critical because when she wrote about India, she was, though she was incredibly empathetic, she was also a woman of her age. So she actually she had a certain, a sort of paternalism built into her worldview. And her son really resented that. So her son really objected to her writing on India. He thought she was too, she was too old to understand. Her daughter thought she wasn't enough of a feminist. And she wasn't really a feminist. That's the point about the mothering thing. She actually always played up. Although she was a woman who mostly worked with women, promoting women issues, being back, as far as I can see, as feminist as it gets. She never called herself a feminist. And I think she was more of a maternalist than a feminist. So she wrote even, I don't describe myself as a woman, I describe myself as a human being. So very, very much in the same spirit that she wanted to connect everything. She didn't want boundaries or subsections or anything. But that created some tension within the family. So yes, I should have mentioned both Eric. They were in the back of my mind.
The next question is, when's your book coming out?
Hmm?
When's your book coming
Well,
out?
we've written a few articles. There's a thesis that was supervised by Rebecca, which is available in the library, which covers mostly the early years of Hudfam. I think she probably deserves a book, but I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I've written a lot about it.
It's just on that. Is her autobiography in print?
No. Also, the 2 volumes. The first volume was published by Ebor Press, which is a Quaker press in York. And the second volume was never published, but the second volume is too frank to be published. It was the second volume goes into some detail about her relationship with her husband and family accounts. So I think it would have been regarded as probably, it's so blunt, People thought, oh, this is a bit too much, too much information. She was very, very old at that stage. She was 88. She dictated her books. So her books are infuriating because she goes from one thing to the next. She will connect Shiva and Morris dancing, the 1940s and the 1970s. You're never quite sure where you are with her. And it's only going through her diaries that you can understand when things happen, because she's terribly non-specific. Any other questions?
Can I ask about the TKZ?
It's a fine TKZ.
So, do you think that they were taking orders here for specific things? So Elisabeth Wilson would be saying, well, could you make tea cozies? And in Hong Kong they were fulfilling those orders. Because I'm wondering why they made the tea cozy.
They made tea cozies, they made coffee, they made a range of mostly textiles. So that's because that's what they could get to, I guess, and the workshops were very much textile workshops. They also made dollies and stuff like that, the usual sort of ornaments. And I think they were probably sold in Hong Kong already, through the Lutheran refugee committee. I think they were already sold in Hong Kong. So a main thing was to actually meet somebody who says, I've got stuff, I don't know how to sell it, and to say, yes, I'll sort it out. And the way she had it done is that she basically she had big issues about this. It's kind of an interesting story because, of course, this is 1960, 59-60 in England. We're just out of fairly difficult periods. It's very difficult to import products in the UK without being taxed to death. So she has to negotiate through the Labour Party. She manages to negotiate a tax relief on the import so that things are affordable. And then she produces a fairly glossy catalogue, which is then distributed to good people like you, who then buy it, buy things, and then she had another shipment. So it's very artisanal. It's run from a house.
So not from the Hudfam shop.
No, not. I think the Hudfam shop is concomitant. It emerges at the same time. So I think it goes into the Hudfam shop afterwards. But I think it's first of all a mail order, which incidentally other organizations copied. There's a lot of organizations that developed mail orders in the 1960s for that very same purpose.
So I'm wondering if anyone does know where the Hudfam shop is.
Yes, I was asked that recently, so
It was on Queen Street.
the last shop is now the mailbox shop.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
It was
Because
on Queen Street.
it's on Queen Street.
It was on
Queen
Queen
Street.
Street.
Yeah, I think.
On the lower side of Queen Street.
Yeah.
Yards from here, really. The one, the previous one to that, was on the other side of Queen Street and it's demolished.
Right.
And it was elsewhere in the town before that.
Thank you very much. I sort of knew it was on Queen Street, but I wasn't quite sure which one it was, so I didn't want to put my foot in it. Well, thank you very much for helping. Did any of you work in the Hudfam shop?
Our mother did.
And
It's very true. I mean, some charities say that every penny goes towards the cause, and it was true in Huddersfield Family League shop because she volunteered and they had to take their own toilet paper.
it doesn't surprise me one bit. Doesn't surprise me one bit. She was
formidable.
she was formidable, and a notion of having a nice, relaxing weekend with her children was to
She
actually
was quite intimidating.
to sell stickers to people
Yes.
and boss people around. Did you know her personally?
Only as a customer of the shop and a friend of Reg Napier.
Oh, right. Okay.
So it was through Reg and the shop. But I didn't, never knew. I knew she was. And I served in the library, but nothing.
Well, it's very nice to have people who have been, in the vicinity of Elisabeth. I do believe she was intimidating. I also believe she was also full of self-doubt. So very interestingly, because I've seen it in her diaries, notably one where she says, I had a terrible dream last night, and she describes the dream, and I say, it probably means I shouldn't send that letter I wrote to this woman. I was quite harsh about views on development, so I will think about it again. And she was very much self-reflexive in that sense.
There's a new Discover Huddersfield trail leaflets called
Town of Sanctuary.
Thank you. Which includes a reference to Elisabeth Wilson and Hudfam. Because it was, I think the earliest meeting was at the YWCA, which is now demolished at the corner of New North Parade and Trinity Street.
But it doesn't locate the shop, does it?
No, it doesn't. I don't think it fitted in the editor's sort of remit, but yeah.
Okay, well, I'll look out for it. That's it.
Do we know where the house in Hudtown was?
On Richmond Avenue.
Richmond Avenue.
But again, she had two houses, so that's the second house, which she then split in. I mean, there's another story, which is that while she was in Richmond Avenue, she rented in the 50s. In 40s, she was renting to people who didn't have any revenues, so people were basically homeless. In the 50s, she rented to new arrivals, refugees. And in the 60s, she took on students, overseas students of the Huddersfield Polytechnic. So she says quite objectionable things about the different types of students she got, because she wasn't a fan of the ones from Saudi Arabia, for example. Anyway, but so she wasn't free of prejudice. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. She was a woman of her time, but she certainly. She always had people in her house who weren't of her family. That's for sure.
So the Jewish refugee stayed with her?
They stayed with her for 2 years at the beginning, and then they were German Jewish refugees, and then they moved out. But she stayed in contact with these people throughout her life. I think she was corresponding a lot, including to the BBC. I found a lot of letters, Mary Whitehouse style, objecting to the tone and the lack of educational value of the BBC programs. So plus ça change. she was also writing to MPs a lot, you know. So she was well known in the House of Commons. Barry Sherman actually was a correspondent of her. So
Yes, Barry will remember her.
I'm sure Barry would. Yeah, I just haven't managed to catch him. I wait for his retirement. It's imminent, Any other question about any of those?
I'm going to say if anyone does want to come and have a look at the TK.
Yeah, if you want to have a look at the picture, I can give you a bit of context because this is. So this picture is taken in Hong Kong just before she's arrested. So that's a bit of activism in Hong Kong. If you know Hong Kong, I think it's on the side. It's not in Kowloon. So it's on the other side. So it's on the side of the island, near the buildings. This picture here is a picture that was taken in Bangladesh, and these people are refugees. She's on a boat of refugees going to Dakar, and in the background you have a ship that has been sunk during the war. So the war is, literally still, the smoke is still there. This picture is very much this hidden war picture. No, it's terrifying to think about these people because obviously this is a region that became very heavily Khmer Rouge immediately afterwards. So whether any of these people have survived the 1970s, I don't know. These two girls had been burnt with napalm by the Americans, and in fact the Americans arrived as she was there. The American helicopter landed and took the two girls to a hospital in South Vietnam for treatment. So the question is whether they were ever returned to Cambodia afterwards, whether the Americans were covering up their crimes. It's very unclear at that stage. This picture is also from Cambodia, and it represents some of the peace activists walking around and getting into the vehicles that are going to take them to these border towns of Cambodia that have been on the eastern side of Cambodia that have been destroyed. This picture shows the kind of these flowers actually. I need Claire to tell me what they are really. They're kind of they're like 3D embroidery. How do you call that? So they're basically made of textile. They're made of textile, and they are. So this is basically looking at a refugee workshop on the roof of Hong Kong, and looking at little flowers that the refugees have made for themselves out of fabric. So that's the particular picture. And this picture I think I've shown you before. It is this carpet mending that took place in. This one is either from Palestine, this one is from Lebanon, 1970. And finally, this is from my first trip. It's a visit to Agadir in 1960, and I quite like the framing of the pictures, that's what I chose. So there you go. So if you wish to have a look at those images in more detail, that's something I haven't mentioned, but she's actually a very good photographer. And I think that's not a given. I'm a rubbish photographer. And she captures, a lot of her pictures capture something. She left about 1,300 photographs. And those photographs were organized in shows. She used to do a lot of slideshows, remember the slideshows? And so public slideshows with a narrative going with it. Unfortunately, she didn't write the narrative, so I only have a diaries but please feel free to have a look now, unless you have any other question, and I'm very happy to.
Can I just say before anybody goes to have a look at that, just a massive thank you for the talk this evening. I also just wanted to say a massive thank you to Huddersfield University as a whole as well, because a lot of the programme of talks wouldn't be possible without the university partnership. We had the incredible Steve Illingworth last week talking about the Women's Cooperative Guild, which I knew nothing about, which again is absolutely fascinating and came from that relationship with the university. Tomorrow we have a study day on the Indian Textile Archive, which is held by the university. So we couldn't do the programming with Woven and look at our own history and our heritage without that relationship. So a big thank you to the university, to Rebecca for the introduction, and to Bertrand for this evening.
Thank you very much for